The Navy's first ace was Naval Aviator number 85, David Ingalls, in 1918. Flying a British Sopwith Camel for the RAF, he shot down 5 German airplanes in 6 weeks. Plane design and production proceeded unstopped for the next 20 years, and by World War II, naval aviation had become a power to defend our way of life, particularly in the Pacific Theater, after the surprise Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. Just 4 months later, in April 1942, Jimmy Doolittle led 16 Army Air Corps B-25 bombers from the Navy carrier Hornet in a daring raid. They accurately and successfully bombed targets in Japan that sent a strong message to the Japanese leadership. The message: you made a huge mistake bombing America. Navy planes dominated in the Pacific War. Fighters, the Grumman Cat series, the Wildcat, the Bearcat, the Tiger Cat, and the Hellcat. Hellcat pilots shot down over 5,000 Japanese airplanes in the Pacific. And the Helldiver that replaced the Dauntless. There were PBYs, and the Kingfisher spotter and rescue planes, and of course, the 400-mile-per-hour Corsair. The Corsair was one of the most successful fighter planes of World War II, and very effective later in the Korean War. Most of its fighting in World War II was in the Pacific Theater against the Japanese. The Navy flew the Corsair from aircraft carriers, the Marines from island airfields. It was an air-to-air fighter, it was a ground attack aircraft, and escorted on bomber missions, protecting them from Japanese fighters. The Japanese called it whistling death because of a distinctive sound the Corsair made at high speeds.
It is newly painted in honor of U.S. naval aviator Charles Joseph Obie O'Brien. Growing up building models, hanging out the airport, and devouring aviation books and magazines, Obie took to the skies at 9 years of age in a Ford Trimotor in 1937. Flying was in his blood. In 1946, while Obie graduated from prep school, the Navy started a new program for potential pilots, known as the Naval Aviation College Program. Passing all the necessary exams, he was eligible to attend a college with a Naval ROTC program. He enrolled in Villanova College and was also sworn into the Navy on July 18, 1946, as a V-5 apprentice seaman. After spending the required 2 years in college, Obie reported to Naval Air Station Pensacola, Florida, where he trained in the SNJ and Hellcat. He earned his gold wings in June of 1950. Upon graduation, he reported for duty with Jet Training Unit 1 at Whiting Field, where he logged time in the Lockheed T-01, the Navy's designation for the F-80C Shooting Star. Completing his jet training, Obie was assigned to a Corsair unit. As he says, go figure. Obie has over 7,000 flight hours in 52 types of aircraft and 735 arrested landings on 20 different carriers. He also held the honor of being the only pilot in the world actively flying the Corsair, like he flew in combat until he retired in 2013 at the young age of 85.
359 was my airplane. It had my name on it, and I liked it. Of course, I flew it 3 times in combat. It's been well taken care of. It's had 6 or 7 owners in the last 60 years, and it's just like a brand new airplane. When I got in it, a lot of nostalgia. Some of the instruments I didn't recognize because when I flew it, it was pretty basic, but the airplane smelled just the same. I certainly appreciate the past owner and the present owners taking care of my airplane. Ever since I was a little toddler, about 5 years old, I was interested in airplanes. We were vacationing in Ocean City, New Jersey. Fortunately, there was an airport very close to us. And I would go down there on my bike and hang around and talk to the people. And I saw a sign that says there's going to be a tri-motor Ford airplane here next week. And you can get a ride on one. So I thought that was a good idea. And the price for me would be $2.50. $2.50, I was only 9 years old. This is 1937. $2.50, I was a paper boy and I got a penny of paper. So that was 250 papers I had to deliver to get that ride. So I went down there and I got onto the airplane. We had about a 15-minute ride and I came back. I had not asked my parents whether it was okay or not because I figured that permission was to be very hard, impossible to get, and forgiveness might be a little bit easier. So I took my ride, and then when I came home, I told my mother what I had done, and she was very, very unhappy. And I told her how sorry I was, but I got a good ride. My father just kind of smiled. That was the last ride I had until I joined the Navy and started Navy flight training. But that cemented my desire to fly. There is no doubt that what I was going to do later in life. I graduated from high school in 1946. In 1946, everybody in the Navy was, all the pilots, everybody was getting out and going back to school. The Navy saw that there would be a valley of lack of pilots during those years, and so they started a 1-year program, which would, if you could qualify, get yourself into an NROTC college, pass all the aviation, the physical and the mental, pass the interviews, they would let you enlist as an apprentice seaman, send you to school for 2 years. I went to Villanova, by the way, for 2 years, $50 a month on books and tuition. And then following that, you would go to Pensacola, be sworn in as a midshipman, and go through flight training. I went to Pensacola in 1948, took basic flight training in the SNJ, qualified on the carrier in the SNJ, went down to Corpus Christi for advanced training, flew the Hellcat, the S6F, went through that training, qualified on the carrier in the S6F, and got my wings in June of 1950. In 1950, I was assigned to take jet training. The Navy had some F-80s, we called them TO-1s, single-seat jet. And it was only a month course, 25 hours, and I went through that and enjoyed flying a jet. It was a new experience for me after flying the SNJ and the S6. My first flight, I had never been in a tricycle landing gear. I had never been in any kind of a jet, even a commercial jet. And so it was quite a thrill to sit there, be able to see the runway clearly, and add the power and take off. it was quite a thrill. After completing the jet training, I went to talk to my detailer, and he said the Korean War had started, and they were starting a couple of squadrons down in Jacksonville, Florida. It was 4 Corsair squadrons, and they needed pilots. So guess where I was going? I was going to Jacksonville and fly Corsairs, which I had mixed feelings about. I would like to fly the Corsair, but I also would have liked to flown jets. But in the end, I think the best thing that ever happened to me really was to be assigned to Corsairs. I made 2 med cruises in the Corsair, flying the F4U-5, the first cruise, the F4U-4, the second cruise, and then we went to Korea flying the F4U-4. The skipper called us into an all-pilots meeting and said, guess where we're going, guys? Because everybody really was anxious to do our share. The West Coast pilots were flying, and we were going into med. We thought maybe we should be doing our share of the fighting. So we left Mayport, Florida, on the Lake Champlain, which is a Essex type carrier, straight deck, of course, and went through the Med, through the Suez, and into Korea. We flew a line period from the Lake Champlain and cross-decked over to the USS Boxer, and they sent a jet squadron over to the Lake Champlain. It had something to do with the fuel capacity of the ships. On my first launch, we briefed in the ready room for a strike on a bridge. The bomb load was going to be a 1,000-pound bomb and two 250 bombs and six loaded 50 caliber machine guns. We briefed very carefully the launch of four Corsairs. I was number 4. Went out to the airplane. At that time, I remember being a 25-year-old bachelor, hot to trot, ready to go out and break something. Really. So when I got in the airplane, you would taxi up to the deck launch officer. He would give you the wind-up signal after you gave him a thumbs up that your instruments were okay. You would add as much power as you could until you felt the tail just getting very light. When he gave you the signal to go, you would add full power, and that big 13-foot prop, a lot of torque, so you needed a lot of right rudder. And went off the deck. The ship would be making some of its own wind, at least 32, maybe 35 knots. You were too heavy for the natural wind in the ships. They would download you a little bit, but that didn't happen very often. In any case, when you went off the end of the deck, you would settle just a little bit. You would get your wheels up as fast as you could, get a little bit of speed, raise your flaps gently, and turn off. The flight that we had was on a bridge in North Korea, and it was heavily dependent on both ends. I think there was also railroad tracks on it. We climbed up to 8,000 feet, saw the target, and we made individual runs. The leader went down, number 2, number 3, and number 4, which was me. By the time I got started in my run, there was pretty heavy anti-aircraft fire. And I thought, oh boy. And coming down, I could see these orange, they look like tennis balls coming up at me. And I thought, and I could hear them as they went by the airplane go, woof, woof. And then I thought to myself, I'm seeing only about a sixth of the ammunition being placed. But anyway, we would drop our bombs at about 3,000, the big bomb about 3,000 feet, and then we made 2 more passes to get rid of the other 2 bombs. And with each pass, it seemed like those tennis balls, those red tennis balls I call them, were getting closer and closer and more. In any case, when I got back to the ship, nobody was hit. It was a good flight, and we did significant damage to the bridge. We came back, came around, we all got aboard safely, and when I got out, then I got scared. I was not scared I was concerned, but I wasn't scared until I got back in the ready room and said, oh boy, that was hairy. We flew both, I think, of the 24 missions, I flew 11 close air supports missions. The rest were strikes. And when we couldn't do a strike, we would be set free to do what we called road recce. And anything in North Korea was moving, wheeled, we would shoot at.
Okay.
On one occasion, I got 2 boxcars, which was good.
Okay. Did you always fly number 4, or did you move up to an element lead
No.
or flight lead?
I was mostly number 4. I was only an ensign.
And you were one of the young guys in the squad.
I was one of the young guys in the squadron. And we flew in sections, the leader and his wingman, and then the section leader, which were the last 2 airplanes. And that would be a more senior officer than an ensign or a JG. But that was my spot, which I liked. And I would try to, when we were making a run, I would kind of get off to the side a little bit or come in at a slightly different angle, because I knew that they had war-sighted those first 3 airplanes, and I wanted to not be in the same flight path. The missions that I liked more than the strikes were close air support. And the way that worked is, after you would launch from the ship, they would shift you to a unit called Red Crown, which coordinated all the close air support missions. If somebody needed close air support, they would go to Red Crown, and then they would assign you a mission. I liked those missions because we could get down low. We knew that we were helping our troops. And that was very rewarding, and it was especially rewarding when you got a message from the ground that, attaboy, and that was really good. We were controlled a lot of the times by an Air Force Mosquito, SNJ, and he would mark a target for us, and he would tell us what the results of our mission were. And I enjoyed that because I felt I was really doing something to help people. And when it got an attaboy, that made me feel great. They would mark the target sometimes. Okay, I'm going to put out a red rocket. And that's the target. Your target is so many feet from that. Okay, I see the red smoke, but then I look around and I see red smoke, red smoke, red smoke. Those rascals were listening to us, and it was clever. They had those things set. I guess they could do it by remote control, but it would, if you didn't know where the original smoke was, and you just came in, you wouldn't know what you were supposed to do. Yeah, I was flying missions, and when the war was over, instead of bombing, we would go out and fly our mission on the last day. Instead of going down, getting low and dropping the bomb, we did what I call dip bombing. You would fly along, drop the nose a little bit, drop your bombs, and get out of there. Nobody wanted to be the last one shot down.
That's...
359 was my airplane. It had my name on it. And I liked it. Of course, I flew it down in Jacksonville, and I flew it 3 times in combat. It was a good airplane. I liked it very much. And on the way home from Korea, came back through the Med, and the Navy told us to drop off 2 of our Corsairs in Port Leote. I volunteered, since my airplane was going to be one of the put in the pool status. I volunteered to take it to Port Leote, and I flew it over there, and with the other guy, and we parked the airplanes, and we were brought immediately back to the ship as soon as we transferred the airplanes. That was the last time I saw that airplane until a couple of years ago. I found that airplane was still flying, and it was in California. Okay, after we got back to Jacksonville with VF-44, we traded in our Corsairs for Banshees, the McDonnell twin-engine jet. So I finally got to jets, a little bit late, but I got to them. I flew them for the next 10 months when I got orders to Pensacola to be an instructor. I was an instructor in Pensacola flying the SNJ, and from there I went to photo reconnaissance school, and came back to Jacksonville in the Photo Crusader. The Photo Crusader was just like the fighter, except it didn't have any armament. It didn't have any guns. It was unarmed. Every carrier had 3 of those Crusaders on it. We did the same thing that the satellites do now. I made 3 cruisers in the Crusader, and our squadron motto was alone, because we flew alone. We were unarmed, because we were unarmed, and we were unafraid. And I always figured 2 out of 3 is not too bad. After leaving the Crusaders, which was a fine airplane, it was the 2nd best airplane I've ever flown. The Corsair was the best, and the Crusader was 2nd best. I got orders to New York recruit aviation orientated officers. That would be the AOC, the crewmen, and the pilots. I did that for 15 months, went to the postgraduate school, finally got my degree, and then went to the USS Bonhomme Richard as the assistant air officer. The assistant air officer is the air officer in charge of all aircraft movements within about 3 miles of the ship and everything on the deck. Spent 15 months there, and then came back to Norfolk. And here I was assigned to a staff, Commander Fleet Air Norfolk, which had air stations and all the fleet airplanes aboard. I was operations officer there. And then I got orders to be 7th Fleet representative, 7th Fleet liaison in Saigon to everybody in Saigon. It was like the go-to guy for carrier questions. I spent 14 months there. I came back to Norfolk and finished out my tours as operations officer of Naval Air Station Norfolk. Meantime, I got attached. I found out there was a group in New York called the Skytypers. They were flying SNJs, 5 SNJs, 10,000 feet. Center one had a fly line abreast. The center one had a computer in it which triggers smoke on all 5 airplanes, which let a dot matrix message across the sky. And that was a lot of fun. I flew with them for 24 years, 24 air show seasons. The fighter factory over in Suffolk had some nice airplanes, and they were going to build a museum is where we are. And they had the Corsair, they had a TBM, and they had a Sky Raider and a lot of other airplanes. The Mosquito, and so I wrote a very nice letter and told the Skytypers I found a better deal, so I was going to fly with them. To get into flying the museum, I had plenty of flight time. I had heavy time, and they were looking for a couple pilots, it was particularly SNJ pilot. So I started flying the fighter factories, SNJ, and then they got the Corsair, and since I had a lot of Corsair time, I got checked out in the Corsair, and since I was checked out in the Corsair, I thought maybe I should check out in their TBM, and when I checked out in the TBM, I thought maybe I ought to check out in the AD, and I did, plus all the other airplanes, and then they built the Military Aviation Museum here in Virginia Beach, and we moved from Suffolk, from the fighter factory, moved everything over here. The surprise that you had for me was that my Corsair 412 359 was flying in California, belonged to a gentleman out there. And my friend Steve contacted him, and he said, if he's qualified in a Corsair, he's more than welcome to come fly his old mount. And over the course of 2 years, there was delayed, and finally we set a date, and we went out to California, to Ramona, near San Diego, and I was fortunate enough to fly my old Corsair that I had left in Port Leote 59 years ago. The last time I saw the airplane in Port Leote, it had been well worn. It was tired. It had been at sea for 8 months, combat in three or 4 months, and it was needed a paint job. When I saw it in Ramona, they opened the hangar doors, and I saw a beautiful plane, just like it was off the line. It was shiny. It was painted up very nice. It had Jesse Brown's name on one side. He was shot down in Korea. And on the other side was Hudner's name. Tom Hudner was a pilot who landed next to Jesse Brown in an unsuccessful effort to save him. Hudner was later on presented with the Congressional Medal of Honor for that action. Unfortunately, Jesse Brown was not recovered. No, I thought about the people who had flown that airplane. In addition to myself, they were all retired or passed on, and all the fun we used to have in the squadron, and it just brought back memories of nice times and nice people, and times that I relish.
And I took a photo of you sitting in an easy chair with a bottle of cold water, and I remember the airplane was parked right in front of the hangar, and you were staring at it. It seemed like you were a million miles away.
I was a million miles and 60 years away. I got a call from you, Steve, about 2 months ago, maybe 3, and you mentioned to me that my airplane was no longer in California, but it was in Florida. And the owner, the new owner, wanted to paint it in its original colors from VF-44, and with my number 412 on it, and the squadron designations, the F on the tail, and the yellow wingtips and rudder, top rudder, and that's great. They're going to put your name on the airplane, and I was ecstatic. I understand that it was in the Bob Black Sheep series. It was in the Reno Air Races, and it's just like a brand new airplane. When I got in it, a lot of nostalgia. Some of the instruments I didn't recognize because when I flew it, it was pretty basic, but the airplane smelled just the same. Just, so I certainly appreciate the past owner and the present owners taking care of my airplane.
The last, and possibly the greatest propeller-driven fighter aircraft, was the Vought F4U Corsair 1. With their bent wings, the Corsairs are instantly recognizable, but the full extent of their capability is generally not as well recognized as that of other more famous types. However, the F4U could not only outfight the best of the Axis fighters, but also those on the Allied side. They were powerful, fast, well-armed, strong, and reliable. Ideal fighters. At the end of the war, orders for most aircraft types were cancelled, but the F4U remained at the heart of the busy development and production program. For those who like to argue the relative merits of World War II fighters, this continued development indicates the high regard in which it was held by the U.S. Navy and Marine. The Corsair not only continued in production and use into the jet age, but in Korea they encountered jet fighters in combat, and the outcome was not always to the jet's liking. The F4U's peculiar wing reflects the nature of the team that designed it. Thought engineers have often resorted to the unconventional where it worked, perhaps reflecting the age of the company. Founded in June of 1917. Back in those days, intuition was as reliable as science in aircraft design, and Vought has never been in the habit of dismissing the unusual too hastily. Over the years, the company has made a tremendous contribution to aviation in general, and in particular, to United States naval air. The first aircraft to take off from the deck of the U.S. Navy's original aircraft carrier, the Langley, on October 17, 1922, was a Vought plane, a VE-7. This was only one of a number of such historic events for the country. Earlier, the E-7s had equipped the Navy's first two fighter squadrons. The relationship between the Navy and the company has persevered to the benefit of both. The company's founder was Chance Vought, born in New York on the 26th of February, 1890. His father built sailing ships for a living, but the young man turned away from the sea after completing his mechanical engineering studies, and in 1910 started his association with flying machines. Chance Vought died young in 1930, but by then he had built a thriving enterprise that has survived several moves around the U.S. as well as changes of ownership and management. The company's reputation for outstanding aircraft stretches back to their earliest designs, and the F4U was to continue this tradition. The company's first plane was built in a third-floor room of a disused ladies' stocking factory. It was lowered to the street in sections out of the windows and then reassembled so the engine could be tested with the plane tethered to a telephone pole. Despite this unusual birth, it was a very successful design. The plane was the VE-7, VE for Vogue Experimental, and 7 because it was Chance Vaught's 7th design. It was modestly described as a two-seat advanced train, But its reception by Army pilots in February 1918 was so favorable that it was ordered into mass production as a fight. After the war's end, some production of the VE-7 continued, including the first orders for the Navy. Several versions found their way into Navy use. There were twin-seat observation and foc planes and the single-seat fighters. Vaught's next plane, the VE-8, was similar to the VE-7 in many respects. The company drew from the VE-7 in different ways, and the VE-7 family were produced into the 1930s, though not as a thing. Vought continued to work on fighter designs, but to little avail. These aircraft were very impressive and included the company's first all-metal plane. However, they were failures in the marketplace, and Vought was only kept alive by its successful sales of other aircraft, including a succession of observation planes called the Corsairs. This is a name that has become very closely associated with Vought. Through the 20s and even the 30s, the Vought company quietly prospered. It was small and sometimes struggled to meet orders, but it continued to have successful designs under production. These included the Vindicator light bomber and the Kingfisher catapult plane, but a successful fighter design continued to elude them. The V-141 was a spectacular failure. Two test versions under evaluation by the Army and Navy in 1935 had disappeared without a trace. The plane had appallings in recovery, and despite the best efforts of the Vought men, it remained dangerous. Renamed the V-143 after stretching, being given a new tail, it still failed to impress any buyer. Meanwhile, in 1936, the company's chief engineer, Rex Bizek, had commenced work on another fighter for the Navy. The design was completed and submitted in 1938. This would be the firm's sixth fighter submission, and the first one to be successful. Within the company, it was referred to as the V-166, but it was accepted for testing as the XF4U. Bizek had devised the smallest practical aircraft around a Pratt & Whitney project for a gigantic supercharged Double Wasp radial engine that would deliver 1,800 horsepower. At the time, this was the world's most powerful engine.
Generally, it takes about 4 years to develop an aircraft engine from the time you start the design to the time it goes into production. So it was 2.5 years before we flew the engine in the Corsair. We flew an experimental engine, which then had a rating somewhere around 1,600 or 1,700 horsepower. Our experience with the engine in the early flying was quite good. We couldn't get the airplane to altitude because the fuel system vaporized at the higher altitude, but we were able to fly effectively at sea level and up to 20,000 feet or so. The early airplane did so well, in fact, that after a rather limited number of flights, it was flown over a speed course, and it made a speed of 405 miles an hour. This was the fastest that any military airplane had flown up to this time, and that made quite a big impression. This particular flight had an effect far beyond the Corsair program, as a matter of fact, because in the late 1930s, there was a technical debate in the aircraft industry of whether future engines should be air-cooled or liquid-cooled. The air-cooled engines were lighter and simpler and less vulnerable to battle damage. But the liquid-cooled engines were supposed to have a lower drag. So the military were leaning very much in the direction of liquid-cooled engines. Finally, in late 1937, just after the R-2800 was started, they came to Pratt & Whitney and said, this is the Army Air Corps, not the Navy. Army Air Corps came to Pratt & Whitney and said, "We're not going to buy any more air-cooled engines from you." Well, that was a tremendous blow, and it was a blow to the R-2800 program at that time. Pratt & Whitney regrouped and started the design of a very large, complicated liquid-cooled engine, which they had no real interest in. Well, they continued the R-2800, but on a lower rate than they should have, until this Corsair flight. And then they invited Hap Arnold, who was at that time the chief of the Army Air Corps, in, told him about the Corsair flight, showed him the R-2800 engine, and he says, "Forget the liquid-cooled engines, and then drive on." So actually the 2800 powered 3 of our fighters in the war. It powered the Corsair and the Hellcat and the Thunderbolt, whereas the liquid-cooled engines, the Rolls-Royce engine powered the P-51, and the Allison engine powered the Lockheed Lightning. One of the interesting and novel features of the power plant system on the Corsair was the combat power system. Normally, an air-cooled engine is limited really by cooling rather than by mechanical strength. It's usually possible to make something a little stronger, but the cooling is a definite limitation. So at high power, these engines were actually cooled partially by air and partially by fuel. The engine was enriched so that some of the fuel wasn't actually burned effectively. It just went through the engine to cool it. Several years before the war, a couple of engineers at Pratt & Whitney had patented a water injection system to get more power out of the engine by cooling the cylinder with water. Nothing was done about it at the time because the water and fuel consumption was so high that it really wasn't practical to use it for more than 5 minutes or so. However, during the war, it was proposed that this would be all right because combat pilots, 5 minutes would mean an awful lot to them. So Pratt & Whitney developed this combat power system. And what it consisted of was a system with a pump and a tank which added water to the cylinder. When the pilot advanced the throttle beyond a certain gate, it also leaned out the mixture and permitted the engine to be operated at a higher manifold pressure. My good friend and test pilot Boone Guyton did the early flying on this. Very dangerous and challenging work because the engine was operated right up to the limits. All of us who stayed on the ground owed a tremendous debt to Boone and his men because we were completely dependent on them to get the information in flight that we needed to make the engine work. Well, he took the thing up there, and we had a very major engine failure, which resulted in some big problems for Boone. Fortunately, he got through it all right. That particular system gave over 20% increase in power, and the combat pilots loved it. Boone and his group there risked their neck every day to make this airplane a success, and all of us owe them a lot.
It would be over 4 years after the first test order before the first production plane was delivered. Those 4 years, Europe had slid into a war. On the 1st of October 1940, the original X-plane became the first U.S. fighter to fly at over 400 miles per hour in level flight. This not only justified faith in the radial engine, but it confirmed for the Navy that this was the plane needed to fill the role of carrier fighter. The Vought Company was affiliated with Sikorsky under the umbrella of the United Aircraft Corporation. The Corsair's power plant was a twin-row 18-cylinder air-cooled radial engine, with an initial bore of 5 3/4 inches and stroke of 6 inches. By the end of the war, Pratt & Whitney engines were being produced at over 30 plants in the USA. 26 of these were within the company's control, and 6 other companies were producing the engines on a nominal wartime license fee. The F4U was designed to be a brutally effective fighter, but it was not an easy airplane to land. a point of concern that led to delays in its full acceptance into service. The F4U was designed from the outset as a carrier fighter, and as a result, much consideration had gone into making its landing gear as strong as possible. A huge propeller demanded a lot of ground clearance. This would have meant a very high landing gear. The inverted gull wings were specifically designed to compensate. An unconventional wing was no obstacle to the Vought team. A fighter needed as much power as possible, and if this could be best delivered with a strange wing, then so be it. The cockpit was pushed a long way back down the fuselage, and visibility in landing was restricted. The landing gear would be taking stresses above the norm, and the pilots would be concentrating more than was necessary with other types. Despite impressively successful trials, the Navy was reluctant to commit its carriers to the Corsairs' protection. The Grumman F6F Hellcat, much more conventionally, was preferred. Though designed as a carrier plane, first U.S. Corsairs were restricted to land-based service with the Marine. The airstrip on Guadalcanal, renamed Henderson Field, was completed and turned into a major asset in the continuing fighting in the Solomon Islands. Steel matting stabilized the surface and made operations safe. Marines settled him to a long occupation. When the Japanese gave up their attempts to evict the Marines from Guadalcanal in January 1943, they had already suffered severe losses. However, Japan continued to deploy strong forces. At that time, they still had planes that outclassed their American opponents. Soon, the first Corsairs arrived in the theater to play their part. The Marines were well aware of the reservations about the Corsair, and initially approached their new planes with caution. This evaporated quickly, as the experience of flying the F4U convinced the pilots that the machines were not. Marine pilots were soon proudly asserting that they were flying the best fighter in the world. Eventually, their voices would be heard. On the 12th of February 1943, Corsairs' combat career opened with the arrival of a squadron at Henderson Field. But next day, they escorted bombers to Bogan, a mission that had previously been out of the question because of the short range of the available fighter. Typical of the wartime Marine bases, conditions at Henderson remained fairly limited, with most servicing being carried out in the open or in tents. The Corsairs were maintained and armed, refueled, and turned around fast. As both shield and aggressive forces, they had to be constantly aware. The first squadron on Guadalcanal, VMF 124, established the Corsair as a success. In their tour of duty, they shot down 68 Japanese planes against losses of 11 Corsairs and 3 pilots. The squadron provided the first F4U ace, Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh, who downed his 5th plane on the 13th of May. Walsh went on to have 21 combat victories confirmed. The Corsairs were now being produced in large numbers, and the enthusiastic Marines welcomed them. The F4Us played very little part in the European theater. In contrast to the fragility of the Japanese planes, The F4U was built taut. The huge engine provided power to handle the weight of the arm. In the hands of the Marines, the Corsairs built up a formidable reputation in air-to-air combat. The Japanese recognized the significance of the Corsairs aright. They had lost the superiority they had enjoyed with the Zero, and they would have little chance to reclaim it. Victory rolls and swoops above Corsair bases were frequent, as pilots celebrated their successes. 9,441 F4U-1s were produced. This number included several subtypes and numerous modifications. Altogether, 500 major engineering changes and over 2,500 minor alterations were made during the production of the F4U-1s. Corsairs were to be used by several countries during the war. In particular, well over 2,000 were obtained by the British for use with their fleet air arm. In contrast to the U.S. Navy, the English were quick to seize upon the potency of the plane. Whether it had ideal landing characteristics was secondary to its demonstrable power. Accordingly, they deployed the Corsair to their carriers. The British enthusiasm was to have a strongly persuasive effect when the U.S. Navy came to reconsider the Corsair for its carriers. The British had been pioneers in carrier aviation and had been very influential in its development. British experimentation and theorizing had led the way. Their opinions were treated with respect. In spite of their stained reputation, the British were often highly adventurous. Reducing the concept of a floating runway with the bare minimum is indicative of it. They were soon flying them from as many as it were near, after cutting 8 inches off the wings to make them fit below decks. The British did not have an easy time of it at first. The pilot seat was too low, and this, combined with being so far back, meant that the pilot had very poor visibility. In addition, the undercarriage had too much bounce. These were the very factors that influenced the U.S. Navy to reject the plane for carrying. The British persisted in carrier trial. Later modifications to raise the pilot seat and stiffen the landing gear further reduced for viscount. In April 1944, reacting to the British experience and the enthusiasm of Marine pilots, the U.S. Navy began a new series of Corsair trials. The success of these trials eventually worked to reverse the earlier decision. The F4U was cleared for carrier service. These were Marine pilots with Corsair experience who had been redeployed to fly from the USS Essex. The Corsairs were simply the most formidable fighter aircraft available, and the Navy had great need for them. The fury of kamikaze attacks that had started in the Philippines would continue to the end of the war, and the Corsairs, as interceptors, were the best available forward defenders.
The first time I saw the XF4U-1, the predecessor of the production Corsair, was in the mock-up stage. It sat down behind some curtains in the experimental hangar, and I was fascinated. I'd just come out of the Navy, and we had been flying much slower and smaller aircraft. This airplane was tremendous in size. The cockpit was large, and it was unique by those very graceful gull wings, inverted gull wings, if you will, and by the smoothness of the fuselage. I thought it was a tremendous airplane, and I had an immediate desire to want to fly it. I guess any pilot would. I was awareness of my luck in flying the Corsair on the first takeoff of the airplane. I started flying it about the 9th flight after Lyman Bullard made the early flights, got the engine squared away. And the whole flight produced a mixture of awe and just an awareness of what a tremendous design the engineering team at Vought had produced. It was a magnificent airplane, and I immediately simply fell in love with it, literally. And I wanted to continue flying this airplane. It was not just incomparable to any speed or climbing ability or firepower airplane that I had ever seen in the fleet. It had many, because of its unique wing structure and largeness and long nose, it had many sobriquets. I call it Baby. The other nicknames it had were immediate, and they were forthcoming okay. One, of course, was Old Bent Wings, and that was because it had those inverted gull wings. For instance, the Marines, during the Western Pacific operation, in the latter days, were using the airplane almost exclusively as a dive bomber as well as a close air support airplane, as well as a fighter and interceptor of Zeros and kamikazes. They called it the Sweetheart of Okinawa. Then, of course, the last one was what I named the book that I just completed on the airplane, Whistling Death. Whistling Death came from the Japanese because the airplane made an extremely high whistling scream sound as it came over, as it passed over. And you could always tell it. It was a signature. The airplane had begun already to down Japanese Zeros at a high rate. And so its fame was known along with this sound, and the Japanese decided they'd call it Whistling Death. And that's why the name of the book. Vaught's design team, a great group, came up with innovations to match the advanced power and speed of this airplane. It was a giant step. It was pushing the state of the art, if you will. We started out with an experimental R2800 engine, a Double Wasp. This went on to the production engine, and we carried the whole power plant system along with the new airplane. So we were pushing the state of the art, and the advanced concepts that had to come along required innovations and a look into the future and a try. We don't gain much by staying with the true and the tried if we're going to advance. So Vought did this. One of the problems with our airplane was, in its early stages, was in establishing the power plant system, which was new, with the airplane as a good integral part and a working operation that a fellow named Don Jordan started to take on as a task. I met Don early on and began to learn about power plants. The engine, this large Double Wasp, and its high performance required infinite amounts of tests. And nearly every time it got to be almost laughable, but nearly every time I went up, old Don Jordan wanted some type of test. We could perform them on the way and doing stall tests or other things, and it wasn't really that great a chore. But I became very friendly with this person who was extremely knowledgeable about engines. I learned from him so much in the course of these discussions, and he was always pleasant to deal with, that I had no problem in understanding what I was supposed to do with the airplane. If the engine went sour, it wasn't Don Jordan's fault. It was because we were pushing it right to the edge of the envelope.
When the F4U's entered Farrier service in the lead up to the Okinawa invasion, their primary mission was the protection of the Allied task forces from the growing menace of kamikaze attacks. Kamikazes confirmed the fears of the U.S. about Vietnamese fanaticism. Japanese soldiers have stunned their American opponents in fighting to the last man. Japanese sailors had spun away from ships trying to rescue them in shark-infested waters. Now, from the death throes of the embryo, young men were flying their aircraft as guided bombs to crash into Allied ships. Despite their muscle, the kamikaze attacks didn't work now. Even as 90% of an attacking force were shot down, a remaining 10% was still potentially lethal. The only ships relatively impervious to the raids were the battleships and some of the British carriers on their decks. The Corsairs' arrival on the carriers coincided with a crescendo of kamikaze missions. Around Okinawa, the Japanese defiantly threw in massed raids as well as the normal smaller. 10 massed attacks totaled some 1,500 sorties out of a total of around 3,000 attacks in 3 months. Over 400 ships were hit. This works out at around 1 strike for every 8 aircraft lost. If the Japanese had not run out of aircraft first, they would eventually have run out of volunteers. Despite the success of the Corsairs in intercepting the incoming attacks, the kamikazes still got through in significant numbers. With F4Us now flying from all carrier task groups, some Corsairs also burned in the kamikaze frames. The best place for a burning plane is somewhere astern, underwater. Damage and fire control became the finely honed skills of professionals in the course of the war.
The first time that I flew the Corsair was on the island of Espiritu Santo. Major Bill Geist came in with the first Corsair outfit into the Solomon Islands, and I just couldn't wait to get into this airplane because I'd heard all the great things about it. And I have to tell you this, that it was like stepping from Model T into a Cadillac. I'd been flying the Grumman F4F Wildcat. In fact, all my aerial combat was in that airplane. And then to get into this airplane was a great change. And while I was up working it out, it was a birdcage model that had the oddball canopy, so to speak. The aerial came off, and the stick that stuck up there for the aerial, that's all the damage I did to it. And I came in, made a perfect landing with the thing, and that was with the short shank on the tail wheel, which gave a lot of pilots a lot of trouble later because it had a tendency to want to ground loop on some of the old boys. So that tail wheel shank was extended and made it a lot easier to land. The thing I liked about the airplane was, of course, the comfort of the cockpit, and the fact that it went faster, was a lot quieter than the plane that I had been flying. I just loved this airplane. It was just a great airplane to dive bomb with, easy to get on the target and stay on the target with. And all I could say about it was an outstanding performer. I remember back with the old biplane, the old F4B4, the old Boeing. That was my first fighter, of course, and I can remember guys, just, oh, that's a ground looping SOB, ground looping my foot. That thing just, if you knew how to handle it, you right down that runway straight, you had no problem with the thing. On our new lieutenants that were coming in there at Goleta, we just gave them the manual and went over the thing step by step and did give them systematic checkout. And we didn't have any problems at all there with ground looping or any other problem on getting the plane off and on. See, the reason that the shank was, maybe I'm using the wrong term, on the tail was lengthened on the tail wheel was so that the plane came up and didn't, these wings that have the bend didn't blank out the tail, so that you would come in and make more of a flat landing in place of this. And it did make a big difference for somebody just checking out in it. It took away the tendency to wander at one point as the tail dropped. And so all I can say is it was not a difficult airplane to fly. It was a great airplane from start to finish. The firepower happened to be the 650 calibers. And of course, that's, to me, is the greatest gun that was ever built. They worked great, and when you hit something, they ended the career of that plane or ground target, whatever it was. It was vicious. And you've heard a lot of wild stories where it sort of stopped the airplane. Well, that's a crock. The airplane just moved right on through. You never had any problem at all when you were firing the 650s.
The end of the war coincided with a critical moment in the history of aviation. With the arrival of the jet, propeller-driven aircraft was suddenly aerodynamically inefficient. The U.S. didn't want the Royal Navy Lend-Lease Corsairs, and the British didn't want to pay for them. To satisfy the letter of the law, it was agreed that the British push them over the side. Navy and Marines chose the Corsair as the plane they wanted to keep on. And it was not just a question of the wartime aircraft. New models would be developed and produced. The F4U was still being produced and back-flying combat missions in America's next war. The constant close intervention of the Corsairs, operating from the carriers and from within the encirclement at Busan, was an important factor in that move. With the other World War II types, like the Mustangs and Invaders, the F4Us could carry large loads and loiter for hours. They could deliver accurate close support and tie up road and rail links. As had so often been the case during World War II, the carriers played a major part in asserting control of the skies over Korea. This was ultimately decisive. China's massive reserves could not realistically be risked under the fierce umbrella of American air superiority. From its earliest manifestations as a fighter aircraft, the Corsair had grown remarkably diverse. the Marines had turned it into a dive bomb and rocket platform. The closely coordinated activities of the Marines in Korea also serve to illustrate the outstanding virtues of the Corsair. Big workhorses handled the unsophisticated strips and their buckling matting without complaint. But the severity of the winter caused many problems. There were periods of the war when all aerial activity was suspended. The planes were frozen. By the same token, even the Chinese could not make very much progress in conditions like these. The demand for the Corsair services was such that during the war, many of the planes were recalled from reserve units for use in combat. Their virtues in the close support role were unmatched. The Navy needed them in the front line. Perhaps there were some regrets about the heap of ex-British Corsairs rusting deep in the Pacific. In August 1952, Captain Jesse G. Fulmer became the first American to shoot down a MiG-15 with a propeller-driven plane. Airstrikes by U.S. Marines and Navy Corsairs continued up to the last day of the conflict, 27th of July, 1953.
We had some unexpected help in flight testing the Corsair, which began in February of 1943. I was sitting in the flight ready room, and I got a call from our senior person, Mr. Paul Baker at this time, and he asked if I'd come over and show Charles Lindbergh around the experimental hangar, discuss our projects with him and flying the airplane. I was for a moment overcome because this man had been a hero to so many people for so long, and I certainly was one of them. That I had to collect myself, and I finally did, and after lunch went over and met Lindbergh, and we went down to experimental, had a discussion about the projects, and went behind the classified curtains. He was about the same size I was, 6'4", so it was easy to talk. We could sort of lean together with all the noise and clamor in the experimental shop of metal being pounded, and we got quite a bit said and done. I learned immediately that in dealing with Lindbergh, you measured your facts carefully because he was an extremely careful person about what he learned and what he heard. This relationship continued for quite a while, for perhaps another couple of years. One of the noted ways that Lindbergh operated was in great care of whatever he did, such as when he would sit in a cockpit of a Corsair after a test flight, even a production test flight, and spend a half an hour reviewing his thoughts, looking at his flight test card, and thinking about the airplane. And nobody would approach him and touch him. Well, when he left the house in this car he had borrowed, I noticed he went around carefully and checked the tires. When he got in, he looked at the instruments and spent quite a bit of time, maybe 5 minutes, just checking this plain old Pontiac, I think it was. And when he finally left, I figured that I had a pretty good car, and Lindbergh wouldn't be driving it.
We were having some difficulties with the Corsair right at that time. A few little problems, like the one was that the engine was cutting out when we were doing altitude gunnery above 20,000 feet. And so I went over to see Colonel Sanderson, said that we need some expert to come up here and help us out a little bit. So he says, well, I'll call General Charlie Wallace and see what we can do. And next thing I knew, he handed me the telephone, and it was the general, and he said, well, what can I do for you, Joe? I had been with him at Guadalcanal, so we knew one another real well. And he said, we'll get you up an expert there right away if you need one. And that's what happened. And the next day, or 2 days later, who showed up but Charles A. Lindbergh? And of course, I'd always been an admirer of his from his flight across the Atlantic, and had looked forward to meeting him. And of course, he said he wanted to go to work right away, and he flew morning, noon, and night. Always carried a map in his pocket. He worked on the plane. He found a lot of bugs here and there on these brand new airplanes that we'd just picked up, and he eliminated their problems in a hurry. Not being an engineer, I can't tell you exactly what they were, but the engines functioned perfectly at high altitude. Everything went well, and of course that was put out all through the Marine Corps and the effort that he put in on that. And then the last thing he said to us after being there a month was, you know, if I had my wish, it would be to fly a tail end Charlie in your outfit. And I said, well, don't worry about that. You ever show up and you want to be flying tail end Charlie. And lo and behold, when we got up to Amaral, who showed up but Charles A. Lindbergh, and he flew every mission during the time that he was there, on dive bombing and strafing Cavayang, New Ireland, and Rabaul, New Britain, and all of the sneak missions that we did in the area. So his performance in combat was great.
By the end of the war, the Corsairs' days were clearly numbered. Production had finally ceased in December 1952. The last Corsairs in fighter and attack squadron service were relegated to reserve units in December 1954. The reserves would fly them until 1957, and the French continued to use them until October 1964. In Korea, jets were new and still developing, whereas props were well established and refined. F4Us did the desperate defensive work early in the campaign, and the aggressive work of the latter phases equally convincing. The honor of being the last U.S. Navy user of the F4U went to Squadron VC-4, which flew its last Corsair, a night fighter F4U-5N, in December 1955. 12,571 Corsairs were produced. 7,830 of these were built by Vought. There were 36 major subtypes and thousands of minor variations between batches of planes. Their decline from being the world's finest fighter only saw them become the world's finest ground support aircraft. Both Japanese and American pilots acknowledged the Corsair as the Allies' finest fighter, and also agree they were better than anything the Japanese had, the Chance Vought Corsair.
One of the Corsair's greatness items, however, was immediately apparent. We had the fastest naval fighter in the world. The first airplane over 400 miles an hour for a time belonged to the Corsair. One of its greatness features was its high speed at all altitudes. The R2800 engine gave us its two-stage engine, gave us an ability to go to nearly 30,000 feet and still be faster than the Zero or competing aircraft. I like to think of George Axtell's comments in finalizing this greatness item, George thought of the airplane as a complete one. And George Axtell was an ace and a hero in the Okinawa campaign, and later on. He led the Death Rattler Squadron into action, and his comments about it were, "It's the best fighter there is. It's rugged and it's a workhorse. You can use it for anything, including dive bombing, and it's very effective. You can shoot anything off of that airplane, and it still goes." I thought that literally told us what the airplane was all about for combat.
I'm George C. Axtell. I'm retired Lieutenant General, United States Marine Corps. I commanded in World War II the VMF 323, and I commanded 312 in Korea, flying Corsairs off carriers. I first saw the F4U when I was stationed at the Naval Air Station Anacostia. I noticed the airplane that it was a large single-engine aircraft with a large engine, powerful, the large prop, and it looked so graceful and powerful in the landing pattern as well as on the climb out. I was very impressed with the aircraft. What I liked about the airplane that it had power, it was maneuverable, and I thought relatively easy to fly. The first opportunity I had to fly the airplane in combat was in Okinawa in 1945. We entered at the beginning of the Okinawa campaign.